My husband couldn't forgive my past mistake because of a 15-year-old videotape. 10 days ago, I found out that my wife of 6 years was recorded on camera at a friend's bachelorette party with 2 male dancers. This event was secretly filmed by another woman at the party using a cell phone. Later, that woman told her boyfriend, who happened to know me. Although this guy and I aren't friends, we do share some mutual acquaintances from high school. His girlfriend told him not to reveal the video or share it with anyone, and they kept it hidden all these years. It's important to note that this guy and I have never been on good terms. We've merely crossed paths due to our mutual connections. However, they broke up some time ago, and since then he's been casually showing the video to his friends as a sort of entertaining story. It became a recurring topic at gatherings, meetings, or nights out purely for amusement. Most of the women seen engaging in the video, some of the girls were in relationships at the time. I can't help but think they might have been mocking me and the other guys, although that might just be my own insecurity talking. The story hadn't reached me or any of my close friends until about a month ago. One of our mutual friends had a drink with this guy, and the conversation somehow steered toward the story. He began joking about how his ex-girlfriend had recorded a group of girls going wild at a bachelorette party. The bachelorette party included 2 dancers getting involved with one of the women, who happened to be my girlfriend at the time and is now my wife. Apparently, he had trust issues with his girlfriend back then and kept a close watch on her activities. So, she recorded everything as proof of her innocence in case he suspected her of cheating. This led to her involving her friends to demonstrate to her then-boyfriend that she was the innocent and virtuous one. According to our mutual friend, during this incident all the women, including the one with the camera, went backstage into the dancer's dressing room. My girlfriend was the only one that went all in, not just BJs and flashing. She took on both dancers at the same time in their dressing room while her other friends gave BJs and flashed. She was being plowed by both dancers while the other woman secretly recorded. About a month ago, my friend became aware of this situation and felt the urge to confide in me. However, he grappled with this decision because he was well aware of my current happy marriage with they had a close bond with both of us. He understood the depth of our love for each other, especially considering we have 2 young daughters together, aged 3 and 5. 11 days ago on a Friday, my friend reached out to me and expressed a desire to discuss something crucial. His tone during the conversation indicated the significance of the matter. I believed it was a substantial issue, possibly related to some challenges he was facing, and he needed someone to talk to. Over the years, our friendship, which began in high school, we've always supported each other. The next day, we met at a bar. I noticed he was already there when I arrived. He seemed anxious, so I figured it had to do with me, not himself. I grew up in a rough neighborhood. I'm a big guy, 6 feet 3 inches. I've had a few run-ins with the law, mostly related to my crew activities. I've always been seen as a natural leader among my peers. In my teenage years, I used to be quite aggressive and got into numerous fistfights. But going to prison a couple of times, getting married, and having kids have transformed me. It's been over 8 years since I last got into any trouble. I'm less aggressive now, more composed, and mature. Especially since I have 2 kids and I'm in a stable job. I'm an electrician, and I've known one of my friends since high school. He's a year younger than me, and we used to protect each other from bullies. Now that he's 29 and working a decent corporate job, our social circles don't overlap much. When I sat down at the bar, I could tell he had something to say about me. His body language made me anxious, so I turned to him and asked how he was doing. He wanted to know how I was doing and asked what was on my mind. He said that what he was about to tell me might affect my relationship with my wife, but that he felt I needed to know. He didn't want me to find out years down the line that he knew something but didn't tell me. He felt it would be dishonest to keep this from me. At that point, I thought he should just go ahead and tell me. Then he dropped the news a few weeks ago. While hanging out with some friends, one of them showed him a video from about 5 years ago. The video depicted my wife involved with 2 dancers in a dressing room. When I heard this, I was flooded with emotions like anger, confusion, and shame all at once. I had the urge to confront him, thinking it might be some kind of prank, but deep down I knew it was true. I distinctly remembered the day my wife attended a bachelorette party for one of her friends. It was about 5 years ago. We'd been dating exclusively for about 7 months but hadn't moved in together yet. My girlfriend came from a traditional Irish Catholic family, and she was exceptionally beautiful. I truly love my wife, so my initial reaction was to protect her honor and reputation. In the past, the old me might have even confronted my friend aggressively for bringing this up. Maybe that's why the acquaintance didn't inform me earlier. I inquired if my friend had the video was on his friend's phone. He said he only saw part of it, but I suspected he was lying because people don't usually watch just part of something like that. However, that detail doesn't matter now. I realized my friend wouldn't bring me here just to play a cruel joke about my wife's affair. That would be extremely risky with someone like me. So I asked him how I could contact the guy with the video. My friend said he could arrange something. I asked if I could have the guy's phone number, and my friend stepped outside to make a call. We went outside together, and when he came back, he told me the guy wasn't answering but had sent a text. My friend said he'd keep me updated once he heard back. I wanted to leave the bar and call my wife right away, but my friend said I should think things through, so I decided to stay at the bar and talk. I told my friend about my relationship with my wife, which had been great up to that point. I never expected her to be involved in something like this during the first year of our dating. She did show a bit of a wild streak, but I didn't realize how wild it was until now. After that first year, it seemed like she had turned her life around and left that party phase behind. However, she does change when she drinks. When we started dating, she was still in that party phase, but that's no excuse. Because we were in a committed relationship when she attended that bachelorette party. Our relationship, like any other, has had ups and downs. Her issues with alcohol were a problem at one point, but she got it under control, mainly because of our first daughter. While I was talking to my friend, he received a text from the guy and said he could share his number with me. I immediately called him and asked if we could meet so he could give me the video on a flash drive. He told me he was out of town. He said he'd return the next week. I asked for a copy of the video and how much he'd want to delete it from his phone or other storage. I hoped he'd agree to delete it, but he asked for $11,500. That's one of the reasons I never liked him. I managed to negotiate it down to $11,000. There seemed to be no reason for him to hold on to this video. My ex-girlfriend and I were no longer friends, and I doubt she'd hold it against me. I think he was just being a jerk, but I was glad he asked for money because it allowed us to create a legal agreement preventing him from releasing the video to the public. That way, I'm the sole owner of the only copy. My aim was not only to protect my wife but also my daughters and myself from further embarrassment. The thought of a tape of my wife circulating on the internet would be a huge embarrassment for my family. I wanted to handle the situation as best I could before speaking with my wife. From what I've heard, the video is too explicit to even think about. I was too drunk to drive, so I had to get a lift home and leave my car in the bar's parking lot. When I got home, I could barely walk through the door. All I remember is calling my wife at 4:03 a.m. and passing out. I wanted to confront her. That night, I was too drunk to handle it. The next morning, I woke up with a hangover on my couch wrapped in a blanket. My wife was supposed to go to work that day, but she called in because she was concerned about my unusual behavior and wanted to figure out what was going on. She handed me a glass of water as I sat there, and after taking a sip, she asked me what was bothering me. I glanced at her, and all the memories from the events of the previous night came rushing back. I hadn't been this angry with my wife in a long time, and I needed answers. The images of her with those two dancers were all I could think about when I looked at her. I couldn't even find the words to speak. I just started sobbing like a baby. I couldn't remember the last time I cried, and that was one of the lowest moments in my life. My wife seemed bewildered, and she started crying too. She wanted to comfort me. I gave her a hug, but she pushed me away. She was getting frustrated and kept asking me what was going on. I finally told her that there was a video out there showing her with two dancers at a bachelorette party 5 years ago. She looked confused, and then she started denying it, saying it was fake. She insisted that it couldn't be true, but I reminded her of which bachelorette party it was and asked if she was there. She admitted that she was there, but she also said that she didn't remember anything. She was really angry and said she hadn't done it. I suggested that maybe she was drunk and didn't remember what happened, She said she would remember if she'd been with two guys. She asked me to show her the video, but I said the guy with it was away. I really wanted to believe her. She seemed really sure it wasn't her. I thought maybe it was a scam to get $11,000. I wasn't going to pay up, but that amount didn't seem worth a stunt like this. I really wanted to see the video to make sure my wife was telling the truth. The guy messaged me that he'd be back in town on Tuesday, and today is Sunday, so I've been quite anxious. I can't stop thinking about that video. My wife has been acting strangely around the house, doing extra things as if she feels guilty. She keeps asking if I'm okay all the time, making seemed like I was the crazy one, or that I'd made up this whole story. I couldn't wait any longer, so I told the guy we didn't need to meet right away. I could send him $1,000 through Cash App, and he could download the video using Dropbox. He said he didn't have enough space on his Dropbox to delete anything to free up room for the video, so I suggested he create a new Dropbox account. By Monday evening, he had set up another Dropbox account. I had sent him $11,000 via Cash App, and he sent me a link to the video. When I opened it, I saw a group of women, including my wife's friends from back then, cheering with excitement as the dancers performed. Then I saw my wife touching the dancers and their private areas through their clothes. The footage then switched to the dressing room, where my wife and two other women were on their knees preparing the dancers. There were about 5 guys in the video, and then there's another part where my wife was engaged in sexual activity while still clothed. 2 dancers were taking turns. The video was just as explicit as I had feared. It looked homemade and poorly done, but it was undoubtedly her. There was no mistaking it. Her voice was unmistakable. This private moment that I thought was just between us was actually shared with total strangers. It seems like the dancers knew they were being recorded. I don't know if my girlfriend and her friends were aware because they never acknowledged it. She wasn't forced into anything. In some cases, she was actively seeking attention and even taking the initiative. She gave it up to a bunch of guys she met that night. The very first time I met her, she acted like she wasn't so easy. I didn't get the sense that she was some sort of pure maiden when we started dating. She didn't pretend to be that way. I'm questioning everything I thought I knew about my wife. After waiting for about 2 months, she finally had her first intimate encounter with me. Now, she's close with me, especially after our second daughter was born. But here she was, enthusiastically engaging in acts with complete strangers without holding anything back. I just need to vent because I always believe there are special moments you share with someone you love. It just feels like that. My beliefs have been challenged in a way that has affected my self-esteem. I can't help but think that I wasn't enough for her back then, and I'm not enough for her now. I'm aware that I'm not in the best shape, but I was in good shape back then. I'd like to think I'm a good-looking guy, but despite that, she did this willingly with that guy. I'm curious if any of you have experienced something similar. Has anyone else experienced something like this in a relationship? Can't have been just me. My wife was almost perfect before I saw this video. She's a great mother to my 2 girls. She takes care of me, and she's not lazy like most unfaithful wives I've read about on this site. She's completely traditional now, although I might not have said that when we first started dating. She's grown into it over time, which makes it so hard to just walk away from. Regarding your question about protection, they did use it. It doesn't really matter, but they were using protection. She was so into it that she probably wouldn't have noticed if they didn't. I remember how adamant she was about using protection the first time we were close. It actually scored her some points in my book back then. This whole situation makes me wonder if our relationship all this time has just been a big lie. Maybe I don't really know who she is. She had other partners I didn't even know about because she swore blind the person in the video wasn't her. If I just heard about the video and hadn't seen it, I might have believed her. She was that convincing. So now I'm wondering what else I'm believing that isn't true. When she came back home that evening, I connected the video to my TV so she could clearly see it was her. I admit I went overboard because I was furious with her. I thought she'd show some remorse or beg for forgiveness, but no. It was like she had prepared excuses in advance. She even claimed that we weren't in an exclusive relationship at the time and went as far as saying we weren't even in a relationship. I fired back. How is it normal to have closeness with 2 men like that? I went overboard because I was furious with her. I thought she'd show some remorse or beg for forgiveness, but no, it was like she had prepared excuses in advance. She even claimed that we weren't in an exclusive relationship at the time and went as far as saying we weren't even in a relationship. I fired back, even if she was right about us not being exclusive at the time, though we both know she's lying. How is it normal to have closeness with two men like that? She's presented herself to me and to everyone else as someone she's not. She's also changed her story again, saying she was drunk and that alcohol caused them to take advantage of her. I pointed out that she was clearly a willing participant and there was no point in the video where she resisted. She countered by saying the video was doctored and didn't show the whole picture. She also blamed alcohol, but she might have been she was a bit tipsy, but she was fully aware her motor skills were normal and she wasn't slurring her words. She kept lying and making excuses. I didn't want to argue with her, but it felt like she was avoiding full responsibility. She was upset with me for bringing this up. She stated that it shouldn't matter because we were just friends with benefits back then, not in a committed relationship. She argued that it's in her past and asked how I'd feel if she said my past was against me, that she'd accepted me for who I was, and asked why I couldn't do the same for her. We've never had a violent relationship and I'd never considered it, but the way she was dodging responsibility made me think about it. I didn't want to wake up my kids, and I couldn't stand being around her that night, so I decided to leave the house with a few clothes and go to my coworker's house to cool off, because I didn't want to do something I'd regret, especially since I was already on probation. I packed some of my regular and work clothes and went to stay with a single friend who's also a coworker. My wife kept calling me to come back home, but I ignored her calls. I knew I'd have to face the situation eventually, but I was too angry to be around her. She sent me texts about how I wasn't willing to forgive her for her past, comparing it to she also mentioned how she'd forgiven me for spending almost a year in prison for aggravated assault and being on probation for 10 years, which had held me back in life. I didn't go to college, but my wife did, and she's still working as a physical therapist. I earn more because I'm a union electrician during the day and take on additional projects usually in the evenings and after work, which are quite profitable. I felt like our marriage had become a joke, and I wasn't sure. I wasn't aware of the full picture. When I proposed to her, I didn't think I was marrying a perfect angel. I knew almost everyone has some secrets, but this one felt like too much. I was aware she had a history when we got together, but I thought she was just like any other regular party girl. I remembered asking her how many guys she had been with, and she said 5, which was obviously a lie because that was after the bachelorette party. I knew about 3 of her previous boyfriends. She had friends and 2 short flings, so who knows how many more I wasn't aware of. Despite all this, we still had a great relationship. However, another part of me wondered what other lies she had told me. I was deeply confused, and my life felt like it was falling apart. I couldn't stay with my friend for too long because I had electrical projects to work on and deadlines to meet. My house also served as storage and an office for all my equipment, so I couldn't hide out there indefinitely. I had set up my office at my friend's place, so I couldn't hide out there indefinitely. 2 days later, I had to return home because I still had shared responsibilities as a dad and a contract deadline to meet. Divorce or legal separation hadn't even crossed my mind yet. I was still trying to process all the information. I felt depressed, lost my appetite, and had a strong need to talk to someone. My dad has always been there for me in times of trouble. When I was younger, I didn't often heed his advice, which got me into a lot of trouble. But as I've gotten older, I've learned to listen to him more. I decided to call my dad and share my situation with him. He was surprised because he didn't expect my wife to be that kind of woman. He knew she had a somewhat troubled past, much like mine. My parents had grown fond of my wife because they believed she brought out the best in me. I saw her as a positive influence on my life. She had a knack for showing people the side of her that she wanted them to see, and she was quite good at it. Most people who knew her wouldn't think she was that kind of person, unless perhaps you were one of her close friends. My dad has been married to my mom for 36 years, so he has some wisdom about relationships. He did mention that things were different back in their day, since women didn't have access to social media has amplified their interactions with men and their means of seeking validation beyond their local area. These days, women can attract attention from men all over the world through social media. I learned more about this when I checked my wife's social media accounts, but I'll talk about that later. My dad advised me to return home and be a stable presence in the household, especially for the sake of my kids. He suggested that I should listen to my wife in a non-judgmental way, to reduce her defensiveness and consider reconciliation if she's willing to put in the effort. He emphasized that the grass isn't always greener on the other side. He also said that if my wife was able to deceive me, who's to say the next woman wouldn't do the same? He acknowledged that it would be difficult to forget what had happened. If forgiving her became too challenging, he said I should start considering alternative plans. After talking with my dad, I felt more motivated to return home. When I got home to take my daughters to school, my wife wanted to have a private conversation with me. I told her we could talk later that night, and it seemed like she had been crying for a while. To be honest, I didn't feel much sympathy for her because she hadn't admitted to doing anything wrong. I received a text from the acquaintance stating that he had deleted his copy of the footage and no longer had it since I couldn't verify. I had to take his word for it. I also told him I'd be sending him some legal papers as we'd agreed that evening. My wife was already home when I got back. I was ready for her to come clean and admit she'd cheated on me. That would mean basically admitting she'd lied and presented herself differently at the start of our relationship. She was on the balcony when I arrived, but even looking at her, I felt like I was looking at a stranger. My view of her had changed completely. I used to think I was the only one with a troubled past, but at least everyone knows about mine, and I'm willing to take responsibility for it. When I got home, she was on the balcony, which we usually spend time at painting. It was summer, and the weather in Massachusetts is usually pleasant at that time. She greeted me when she saw me, but I didn't respond. I went inside, took a shower, and changed out of my work clothes. A few minutes later, I joined her on the balcony with a beer in my hand. We sat there in silence for a few minutes. My plan was to let her speak and see what other lies she might come up with. I could tell she was expecting me to start interrogating her, but instead I let the awkwardness linger between us. She began by apologizing for her infidelity, explaining that it happened during a different phase of her life. She mentioned that when our relationship had just started, she said it would last, and that she was still in a partying stage where she did things she now regrets. She expressed remorse for her actions and said that she had been faithful to me since then. I interrupted and asked her why she had been intimate with those men on the same night she met them. I had waited for months for her to be close with me, even though she kept saying she wasn't ready. Her response was that she wanted our first time together to be special. This explanation didn't make sense to me. I pointed out that she'd been on her knees with them on the first day, so why did I have to wait for a special occasion? It felt like she was using closeness as a reward for me while she freely engaged with strangers in an explicit manner in front of her friends. I also asked her if there were any other affairs she'd had that weren't. She said there were no other affairs, but I wasn't convinced. She suggested I check her phone and social media to prove she was telling the truth. I pointed out that if she'd had time to edit her story, she'd have had time to delete anything incriminating from her phone. I didn't really expect to find anything, but I decided to take her up on her offer. She gave me access to her passwords for everything. She admitted to doing something wrong, but I still didn't believe her. I had my doubts, and I couldn't trust her fully anymore. But I decided to follow my dad's advice and give our relationship another chance. That night, I couldn't sleep in the same bedroom with her, so I asked her to sleep in the guest room. The next day, I didn't want to check my wife's social media because I didn't think I'd find anything. I figured she'd cleaned everything up if she had something to hide. But I couldn't stop thinking about it, and I found it difficult to concentrate at work. Eventually, I gave in and logged into her social media accounts, reading all her messages. I started monitoring her social media constantly. I soon realized how unhealthy this behavior was. While she wasn't posting explicit content, I was surprised at how many guys were messaging her. I noticed that she was deleting these messages. I had notifications set up, so I was able to see that she was deleting messages from me. I thought maybe attractive women typically receive this kind of attention, even those who aren't posting anything suggestive. Most of the men messaging her were from the Middle East and South Asian countries, so there wasn't much to worry about in that regard. A week later, our relationship was still strained. We were at least talking, but we hadn't been. My wife and I had been close since I discovered the affair, but she was making efforts to reconnect. She was tired of my constant reluctance to move past this, so we had a conversation where she suggested we see a marriage counselor. I explained to her that this was not something I could easily let go of just by talking to someone. I wasn't sure if our marriage could survive this affair and my obsessive monitoring of her social media and text messages. It was taking a toll on me, so I decided to stop, even though it made me feel worse because it seemed like I couldn't trust her. I even began to feel like people were talking behind my back. Once I was at a local bar with some friends, I saw some acquaintances hanging out with the guy who sold me the video. I felt like they were looking at me and then turning away when I noticed them. Felt like they were mocking me. I thought I might be paranoid, but because of the video, I couldn't help but feel like everyone was laughing at me behind my back. It was a really disheartening feeling, and it left me feeling depressed, ashamed, and sometimes even angry. I felt disrespected, and the old me would have confronted them and given them a piece of my mind. These were grown men acting like little kids, but I guess some people never really grow up. Instead of confronting them, I decided to leave the bar and head home early. It had been 2 weeks since D-Day, and during that time, I hadn't been intimate with my wife. I was trying to move on and get close to my wife again. The affair was constantly on my mind. My wife scheduled some counseling sessions, and we arranged for a babysitter to watch the kids while we attended. Before our first session, I was concerned that the therapist might blame me for everything, as I had seen mentioned on this site. It's been about a week since D-Day, and during that time, I haven't been intimate with my wife. I was trying to give marriage counseling a shot, because I was having a hard time moving on and getting close to my wife. The affair was constantly on my mind. My wife scheduled some counseling sessions, and we arranged for a babysitter to watch the kids while we attended. Before our first session, I was concerned that the therapist might blame me for everything, as I had seen mentioned on this site. However, that wasn't the case. The therapist addressed my wife in a polite but direct manner. I won't go into all the details, but it felt like a thorough examination to rebuild my trust. More truths came out, and my wife's reactions made me think there might be more incidents like that. We might never know the full extent, but I didn't feel like my wife was telling the whole truth. The therapist seemed to share my doubts. The therapist encouraged us to work on reconciliation and provided us with techniques to rebuild trust. However, I wasn't convinced that reconciliation would work because my wife seemed to want to control what I knew. The therapist encouraged us to work on reconciliation and provided us with techniques to rebuild trust. However, I wasn't convinced that reconciliation would work because my wife seemed to want to control what I knew. After our third counseling session, it seemed like my wife was losing interest because she felt like she was constantly under attack. I was learning things about her that I had no idea about, and a side of her personality emerged during the sessions that she wasn't comfortable with. She even tried to persuade me to switch to another therapist. I told her I didn't think it was a good idea, but she kept making excuses. She'd show up late or say she was too busy with work to come. Sometimes she'd call to cancel without letting me know. I got the feeling she wasn't really trying to take responsibility for her actions. This was about 6 weeks after I found out about the affair. I finally talked to that friend who told me about the video involving my wife. I asked if he knew how many people were in it. He said people were aware of it. He was actually one of the last to find out. Among his friends, many people we went to high school with, and most of his friends already knew about it. He mentioned that he stumbled upon it by accident. I also asked him about the guys who were making fun of me the other day. Turns out they knew about it too. So I wasn't imagining things. It felt like most of the guys I encountered in our town knew about the video. I was the last to find out, which was really embarrassing. When I got home, I told my wife how much it bothered me that so many people had seen the video and there was a chance it might still be out there. She suggested that we should move away from the area and that she was willing to change her job. It seemed like she had been thinking about moving even before I found out about the video. I just had a feeling she might have been ahead of me. Given the rumors about the video, I thought it would be a good idea to reach out to some of the friends who were in it. Some of them are no longer friends with my wife, and some are still friends but might not be honest with me since they'd want to protect her. Others who weren't her friends have moved away. I've tried messaging them on Facebook, but none of them have responded yet. It's been 3 months since the incident, and I ended up having sex with my wife. She had been trying to seduce me at home, and one night I gave in. It was more about desire and frustration than love. Unlike before, for the first time since I found out about the video, she stayed in the master bedroom. The following night, she tried to initiate closeness again, but I wasn't interested. I usually don't refuse closeness with my wife, so she gave up. She was frustrated and willing to do things in the bedroom I used to beg her for, but I just wasn't into it. She tried to cuddle with me, but it felt suffocating. I put up with it for one more night, but I couldn't take it anymore, so I started sleeping on the couch because I couldn't sleep otherwise. The next day, she said she hated seeing me suffer like this over nothing and suggested giving me a hall pass for a year, but I explained that it didn't change the fact that she wasn't the person I thought she was. Being intimate with other women meant nothing to me. I wanted something more meaningful with someone I loved, but I didn't feel like I could get that from her anymore. About 4 months in, I called my dad and told him I didn't think I could forgive my wife. I was considering legally separating from her. My dad suggested I move to another place for a couple of months. He thought that might help. I thought a break might help. When I got home that day, I told my wife I'd be looking for another apartment close by, so I could still see the kids as often as before. She pleaded with me, but I was already set on moving out. A week later, I signed a month-to-month lease for a furnished studio apartment near my house. I've been having doubts about the whole separation idea. I didn't want to move away from my kids or leave my wife. I really tried to stay, but I felt like a break from my wife would be good for my mental health. I didn't intend to move out permanently, just to take some time for myself. Plus, I still have keys to my house where I keep my work tools and equipment. The night before I moved to my apartment, I had a serious argument with my wife. She got really upset with me, claiming she'd given me space throughout this whole process. She thought I was acting completely irrational, saying, "I've gone crazy for leaving them over something that happened when she wasn't even sure we were in a relationship." I told her we've discussed this before and I believe there are still things she's not telling me. I need some time to collect myself. She asked how long we'd be separated, and I said I'd give it 2 months since most of my things are still at the house. We agreed to work toward reconciliation after moving into my studio apartment. I felt more at ease on the first day, even though it was tough because my wife was really upset with me. She even told our 5-year-old daughter that I'd abandoned them. Who says that to a 5-year-old? When I came to take my 5-year-old to kindergarten and my 2-year-old to daycare, my daughter told me that Mom was crying. She said that Daddy had abandoned them. I told my daughter that I hadn't abandoned her because I was still taking the kids to school. After I dropped my daughter off at school, I called my wife and told her she should feel bad for trying to manipulate our kids by lying to them about me. I asked her not to involve them in this situation, but she refused to admit any wrongdoing. She kept insisting that she wouldn't lie for me because, in her view, I'd abandoned them. I reminded her that the only change was that I no longer live with them, but I've still been fulfilling all my responsibilities as a father. The next day, I took my kids to school and daycare, and they seemed happy after dropping them off. I went to work, then I went straight to my client's job site to finish up some extra projects. Then I went home to rest. It was pretty much the same routine every day. I tried to avoid socializing too much because I didn't want to meet people I didn't want to face ridicule again by seeing that embarrassing video of my wife, so I kept to myself. My wife and I talked about relocating when we reconcile, but for now I was just too busy. I didn't see my wife for the rest of the week, but we talked on the phone regularly. Our conversations mainly revolved around coordinating our kids' activities, and sometimes she even dropped off food at my apartment. It was a stress-free week with no arguments, no kids crying or making demands. Felt like a vacation. It was like a partial vacation. I even thought that once this experience was over, I might move back into my house. I planned to take some time away from my wife and kids to clear my head. Some of my friends go on week-long hunting trips every season in places like Montana and Arkansas. There's one coming up next month, and I've been invited. I've put it off before because my wife always found a reason why I shouldn't go. I usually agreed because the prices can be steep. My buddy got us a group discount for the hunting trip, which was still a month away, but I'd already bought my ticket. We'll be traveling in my buddy's RV, and it promises to be a lot of fun. It's something to look forward to during these challenging times. The next couple of weeks followed a similar routine. However, in the middle of one week, my wife called me because the dishwasher had broken down. She asked me to come and fix it. When I got to the house to fix the dishwasher and was surprised to see the living room had been redecorated. I only ever went there to pick up my kids or grab my tools for other jobs. My tools are in the basement, and I usually go in through the basement entrance while fixing the dishwasher. I noticed that my wife had changed the curtains and bought a new couch. I asked her what was going on. And she explained that she wanted to make some changes after fixing the dishwasher. I took the opportunity to get some things from the master bedroom and noticed that my wife had purchased many new outfits. When we talked about it, she mentioned that she had started going to the gym to get in better shape and work on self-improvement. I have to admit that I felt a bit envious that she was making all these efforts to better herself. I wondered if all these renovations were her way of moving on. As for me, I kept wondering if leaving the house was the right move, even though I knew it was for my peace of mind. After about 2 weeks, as the weather got colder, my wife told me there was an issue with the furnace. I went over to fix it and noticed more changes to the house. I hadn't seen my wife up close since I repaired the dishwasher. When I saw her waiting in the driveway with my daughters, she was always in. She was wearing baggy pajamas, so I couldn't tell she had lost some weight. I mentioned it, and she explained it was her self-improvement month. We talked, and I got the feeling she wasn't as interested in me moving back. Why would she be? She still sees me as the handyman. I'm taking care of the kids and contributing financially. I'm still paying my share of the mortgage. She gets the benefits of having a man around without having to cook or be intimate with me. She's getting the best of both worlds. I told my wife about the hunting trip to Montana, thinking she'd have concerns about safety or cost. She didn't. She was easy to talk to, which made me uneasy. I thought she'd moved on and didn't care if I returned. That's the vibe I got 2 weeks later. I went on the hunting trip with my friends and came back a week later to pick up my daughter from school. As I pulled into the driveway and opened the car door for my daughter, they seemed happy to see me. However, my 5-year-old asked if they were getting a new daddy, which seemed like a strange question. I reassured her that I wasn't going anywhere and asked why she thought they were getting a new daddy. She said there was a guy who stayed at the. I thought maybe my daughter had confused the man with my brother-in-law, who used to stay with us, but she knows my brother-in-law well enough to know he's not Jacob. I even asked her if she meant Uncle Jimia, but she said Jacob was the man's name. I couldn't access my wife's social media or texts because she changed her passwords when I moved. The name Jacob was on my mind all day as I tried to remember if my wife had ever mentioned him before. Before my hunting trip, my wife wasn't as enthusiastic about reconciling. She just wanted me to be there and fix things. I started to think the worst, that what my daughter said was true and there was a man named Jacob involved with my wife romantically. I thought that if I acted unsure about Jacob, it would allow my wife to deny any knowledge. I had a feeling something was going on with him, similar to her denials on the footage where she tried to deny anything was happening and gaslight me. So I decided to visit her that evening while my kids were asleep. I wanted to surprise her by showing up unannounced, but she didn't seem surprised. Perhaps because she expected me due to my recent out-of-town trips. Our relationship remained cordial. I sensed that the idea of reconciliation was losing momentum, but we still operated under the impression that we should reconcile. I had the keys. I went to the house and let myself in. When she saw me, she asked if I was hungry, but I said no and told her I wanted to talk. We sat in the living room, and I confronted her right away about what I knew about Jacob and why she was having an affair. I had agreed to work on reconciliation, so I watched her body language to see how she'd react. She ran her fingers through her hair, which is a sign that she knew she'd been caught. She quickly lifted her head and explained that Jacob was a coworker. They had a close working relationship. Since I wasn't around, she had called him for help with household chores. I pressed her further, asking if this help extended to sharing our bedroom. She gave me a strange look. In a raised voice, I demanded an answer. She admitted that they had slept together twice. She said there was nothing more. I didn't buy her story. I knew there was more to it. I asked her how long this relationship had been going on. She tried to deflect by saying that if I hadn't left her and the kids, this wouldn't have happened. I sensed she was avoiding the question, so I raised my voice again and asked her to answer. That's when she confessed that they'd been emotionally involved for over a year and it had recently become physical. I reminded her that I had suspected something was up back when we were in marriage counseling, which is why she wanted to stop it. The therapist had seen through her. I realized that I may have been deceived all along. In hindsight, I should have recognized that our relationship was built on a shaky foundation. I didn't truly know who she was. I wonder how long their affair has been going on. I've read enough about infidelity to understand that a woman who had multiple encounters at a bachelorette party wouldn't be content with a simple, ordinary relationship like ours. I couldn't believe her. She said the physical affair only happened during my abortion, because I was away. I think there was more to it. I asked her how we could reconcile if she'd been with this guy for years. She didn't correct me, so I figured it was more than 2 times. When I asked if she loved him, I saw a brief hesitation. I stood up from the couch. I told her it was time to stop playing games. I pointed out that a woman who had been close with 2 dancers and engaged in such behavior in front of friends wouldn't have done it just once. I expressed my relief that she was happy with this guy and stated that I now had valid reasons for legal separation. I acknowledged that we had a good run with our 2 beautiful daughters and suggested that it was time to call it quits. I used to wonder if I made the right decision by moving. I'm sure I did the right thing by giving her the chance to make her mistakes. If I had accepted her lies and gaslighting all these years, I might have lived my life in ignorance. I have to thank the marriage therapist for opening my eyes, even though she didn't explicitly say my wife was lying. I was sharp enough to read between the lines of her questions and understand her perspective. It was like one dishonest person recognizing another. I was just a learner. In that moment, I realized my wife was good at covering her tracks. I still had a feeling there was more to the story, and I suspected she was withholding something. When I got up from the couch to leave, she told me she still loved me, but I ignored her and walked away. I went home that day upset because I knew I wouldn't be able to see my kids as often as I'd like. I understood there was no turning back, but at the same time, I felt a strange sense of relief because I had been proven right and her true colors as a cheater had been revealed. It's uncanny how accurate that quote about cheaters holds. I'm not religious, but I slept well that night, feeling like the universe was on my side throughout this experience. It seemed like everything fell into place, systematically, to unveil the lie I had been living. If my friend hadn't told me about the video, all these events would have continued to unfold. If it weren't for what I've learned over the past few months, I never would have realized who I've been living with for the past 6 years. I called my dad the next day to share everything I discovered, and he reassured me that I'd handled things well. He told me not to blame myself because it wasn't my fault and that everything happens for a reason. My main concern now is the safety of my daughters. I need to know who the man my wife has introduced to them is someone you might have heard of. There are individuals who date single moms with daughters for harmful reasons. I wouldn't forgive myself if something like that happened to my kids. The next day, I picked up my children from school as usual. My wife called me to discuss our situation. She said she still wanted to reconcile with me. She promised to cut off contact with the other man. I reminded her that she'd been in a relationship with him for years. The main issue is that for the first time, she challenged my belief that their relationship had been ongoing for years. She said it only became physical recently when I abandoned her and the children. I saw this as an obvious attempt to deflect the blame, and I wasn't buying it. I pointed out that while we were supposed to be working on reconciliation, she had engaged in a physical relationship and even invited the man into our marital home instead of seeking revenge. I believe the right thing to do now was to get a divorce and focus on our daughters because she had already given up on our relationship a long time ago. She responded by blaming me for giving up when I left home. I hung up the phone to avoid arguing with her. Despite her beauty, I knew she'd find another man. She might even find someone better than me. I hoped she'd find someone better for the sake of my daughter. The worst-case scenario would be if she were having encounters with random men in my house. The next day, I reached out to one of my wife's coworkers. They'd worked together at the hospital and her previous job. I called her unexpectedly and explained that I'd recently suffered a work-related injury and needed a male physical therapist. I mentioned that my wife had recommended someone named Jacob and asked if she knew anything about him. I framed it this way because I knew she was knowledgeable about the workplace. She replied that she didn't know any Jacob. I don't know any Jacob. The only Jacob she knew was one of my wife's former clients at their previous job. I thanked her and ended the call. I realized that my question to her had been somewhat deceptive. She might eventually ask my wife about it, so I decided to confront my wife about her obvious lie regarding Jacob being her coworker. I couldn't wait to discuss this with her in person. Moreover, there was no telling when her coworker might call her. I also wanted to let her know about the strange call she received from me, her husband. I called her right away to talk about it. I asked her why she had lied to me about who her affair partner was. I told her that Jacob had been her client for more than 2 years, and she had lied about it. I said it was my right to know that she wasn't bringing strangers and potential dangers into our daughter's lives. She said Jacob wasn't dangerous. He was a widower and a local businessman who owned several hotels. She said he was a good person and that she'd known him for years. She said he'd been her client after his wife died. She said they had good chemistry but couldn't pursue anything because of her marriage. When I left them, she decided to give it a try. She kept trying to shift the blame onto me while also admitting her own fault in the same sentence. After my call with my wife's coworker, I strongly suspected that my wife had been involved in a physical relationship with one of her wealthier former clients for well over 2 years or possibly more. I decided to do a background check on him, and thankfully he doesn't seem to have a history of I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel a bit envious. This man was more successful than me. But I also realized it was important to find out the truth about my wife's secretive affairs after the bachelorette incident. I needed to start fresh. Some of you might suggest a DNA test for my daughter, but I don't think it's necessary because they resemble me too much. I'll keep it short. 2 months later, we got a divorce, and I sold the house, splitting the proceeds. My wife moved in with her affair partner, who owns multiple properties. His main residence is 50 meters away, but I relocated to another city for a fresh start. I found a better-paying job and rented a condo with enough space to store my work equipment. Despite the challenges of adapting to a new area and securing contracts, I was able to make the move. I've been able to keep in touch with my kids, even though I don't get to see them every day. We share custody, and I get to see them every other week. It's been easier than I thought it would be, and the custody arrangement gives me time to pursue my hobbies. I haven't been looking for a new relationship, as I've been focused on work. I don't see myself getting into a long-term relationship anytime soon.